Hi, I'm Kylo, and this video is part of the short course called A Deep Dive into JavaScript Objects using Visual and Mnemonic Learning Techniques, which I offer on thegreatsync.com. We're at a very exciting moment in this short course where we've started to grow our model, our understanding of objects using various Imagi models. We understand objects as ships, we understand what pointers are, we know what the prototype is and where objects inherit from. Now is when we can actually start using this model to look at problems and understand why certain solutions exist. One of those problems that we frequently encounter while working with objects is unintended mutation. Mutation is when we change something, and that's okay if we are intentionally doing that. For example, if we are storing an array and we are pushing items into that array, we are intentionally mutating it. Unintentional mutation happens when we aren't even aware that an object has changed. This often happens when we have nested objects, objects inside of other objects. And we can now use our model to see where that happens and how easily that can happen. So in this next example, we're going to look at some code where an object does get mutated, and we're going to draw the sequence of events so we understand where we're going wrong. After that, we can start looking at cloning and other solutions for mutation. I hope you enjoy the ride.
Here we have a database with an ID, a name string, a data property, which then points to another object that keeps the value. We are then creating this cache. This cache points at the same database object. We then change the data of that cache. What do we think .data.value would look like? We will start off with the main database object. That object has three properties inside of it, one of them being data. Data points at another object. So we'll draw that one and we'll add a single property in there, which will be for value. In order for the database to find this value, it needs a reference value. So this is the reference pointing up at that value. And we have now a database genie, database.data. And of course, the database itself needs its own reference island. And on that reference island, we have a variable called database. The genie we need to locate whenever we want to use that object, which points up and finds that object. But now we have another variable called cache. Cache is assigned to the same database. The database object will only ever have one reference island. Objects don't have multiple references, they only have one, which means the genie cache needs to join database on that island, sharing the same reference, the same telescope that can pinpoint the database object. That means if we were to take this value property sitting on this object, which is currently pointing down at a primitive number 200, if we were to point that property somewhere else, it's going to affect both of these variables because they're sharing the same reference. If we wanted to try and avoid that situation, you might think the solution is to create a separate object that is a duplicate of the database. So it has the same properties, but it's a completely separate object and has its own reference island pointing up at it. We can then put cache on that island rather. But here's the thing with this approach. If it's a duplicate of the database object, we've just created a new one, then the property here, which would also be called data, would be pointing at the same reference island as the original data property. They share the same coordinates for that island, which means no matter if we were to say cache.data.value and point value at somewhere else, or if we said database.data.value, either way, we are using the same reference island to the same object and mutating that single object. So it will affect both variables. What we would need to do is also duplicate this object. So the one that contains the value, we would need to duplicate. Give that its own reference island, pointing up at it, and then point the data property on the duplicated object to that reference island. So now if we wrote the code cache.data.value and pointed it somewhere else, it's not affecting the original value. This value over here is still pointing at 200. Cloning or duplicating objects is the solution, and we will be using an Imagi model to explain how that works.